Transferring imagery between your lino cut blocks, or any relief block for that matter, is an important way to ensure that you know where imagery on plate number 1 is relative to plate number 2. So I've got a couple of methods here, and this first method is the trace and carbon paper method. I've started with a piece of clear mylar, that is the size of the paper I'm going to be printing. In this case, I'm printing a bleed print, so this is the shape of the paper and this is the positioning of the paper. And I've got it attached to a mylar hanger and registration tabs. I start by placing my piece of mylar in the tabs, and I tape it down at the bottom just to keep it from moving. The tape isn't absolutely necessary, but it certainly helps. And using a Sharpie marker, I'm going to go around and trace onto the mylar any and all aspects of block number 1. I don't need to hit every single detail. Really, I am editing the details that I am tracing so that they align with what I have planned, or what I think I have planned for the next block, or the next several blocks. So you'll see me carefully, although slightly awkwardly because I'm trying to stay out of the way of the camera, tracing over elements on plate number 1 so that I will know where they would lie on plate number 2 and I can plan accordingly. So once I've got to the point where I've traced enough details, I can stop, and in the interest of showing you what I've got on the mylar, I'm going to lift it up slightly. And the lovely part about these registration pins, of course, is that I can lay this mylar back down precisely where it was. So I put it back into position, and I can ensure that if there are any other parts that I want to plan out, I can mark them now. So I will lift my tape up and out of the way, and then remove block number 1 from its position in the printing and registration jig, and I can now place block number 2, which is ready for carving, in position, and then a piece of carbon paper on top, finally laying down the mylar and taping it in place so it doesn't move. So for those of you who aren't familiar with carbon paper is an old-fashioned kind of transfer paper that will allow me to put a graphite style line down by tracing over top of the mylar. Carbon paper was used in typewriters in the olden times, and that's where we get the term CC, or carbon copy, when we're talking about emails. Enough about that. We need a pencil or a ballpoint pen, something that is relatively hard, not super sharp, not super blunt either, but somewhere in between. And I'm going to begin tracing right over top of my Sharpie line. I'm going to do all of the lines here. I'm not going to leave any out. I did the kind of editing or the curating of line work when I did the initial transfer or the initial trace onto the mylar with the Sharpie. So I know that the economy of lines that I've got traced on there right now, I want to entirely transfer to block number 2. As soon as I'm done, I can lift the tape up and move the carbon paper and check out my block. It's important to note here that this is purely a guide. Whatever is on the block at this point just gives me an idea of where the lines or the shape from block number 1 will fall, and I can use that to carve. Here's the slightly dirtier, although arguably more accurate method, and that is to start by inking up block number 1. I'm inking it up in a black ink. It doesn't really matter what color you're using, although you're going to want to use a color that you can see. And I'm going to place that into the registration printing jig. Now, what you're about to see next is all done by hand, but some of this could be done on the press if you felt like it. So again, piece of clear mylar taped to a mylar hanger that is the exact same size as my printing paper, into the pins, and then carefully laid down over top of the inky plate. And then using a Baron, which is a kind of hand printing tool, or a flat wooden spoon, I'm going to take a very rudimentary impression from the block onto the mylar. I'm going to lift it up and check to see if I've got all the spots that I wanted to print, and they have. So now I've got wet ink on the underside of the Mylar, which is in fact if you think of it as paper, it's the printing side. And I'm going to take that and I'm going to gently lay it down over top of a second block, a prepared second block. It's been sanded slightly so it's ready to receive drawing or image transfer in this case. And then using that same tool, however I first put the printing onto the Mylar, I'm going to burnish again, and this will transfer some of that wet ink from the Mylar onto block number 2. And if you do this carefully, you could potentially transfer imagery onto several blocks before the Mylar stops allowing you to transfer. That is, you've used up too much of the ink. You see that I just backed the Mylar off just to check to make sure that I transferred enough. I added a little more pressure, and here we are. I've got block number 2 with wet ink on the surface. I can take this block, I can allow it to dry, or I could add a little talc to the surface of it to help the ink dry, and I could use it as a guide to plan and lay out and eventually carve the second block. A nice bonus to this particular process, whether you do it by hand or you do it on the press, is that you have an identical printed copy on the Mylar, which is so handy for setting up subsequent layers or even just working out registration problems later on.